Hi, everyone. It's good to be here today. Thank you to Jess Goldberg, Nancy Quintanilla, and Joseph Lamac for bringing us together and all the organizational labor put into the conference. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm grateful to at least be able to share my work with you through video. And I also want to acknowledge the indigenous land from which I'm presenting to you today, that of the unceded territories of the Ohlone people. So with that, I'll get started. What does it mean to think about hospice care in a torture facility? In 2019, journalist Carol Rosenberg reported that with the aging of those incarcerated at the detention camp at Guantánamo Bay Naval Station and the Trump administration's plan to keep the camp open for at least another 25 years, hospice care was now on the horizon. The oldest prisoner at Guantánamo is in his late 70s and uses a wheelchair and walker after undergoing a series of spinal surgeries for a degenerative disc condition. And the youngest is in his late 30s and lives with multiple chronic conditions after undergoing forced rectal feedings while held captive in a secret military detention site in the early 2000s. Many of the men who remain incarcerated at Guantanamo are pre-diabetic and will soon perhaps require dialysis. Others might eventually need hip and knee replacements and wheelchair assistance. Many already use assisted breathing devices during sleep. There are talks of building a small prison that would also provide communal hospice care capacity and care for chronic conditions such as high blood pressure, cholesterol, joint pain, and diabetes. To do this, the military would need to make architectural changes like increasing the width of the hallways as more and more of the men will soon be in wheelchairs, requiring that cells be bigger with ramps and grab bars. The possibility of hospice at Guantanamo might be viewed as a welcome change for a detention camp that's come to be understood by many as a site where abject violence abounds with minimal oversight or legal accountability. Sitting outside US borders, Guantanamo Bay appears to exist beyond the reach of law and procedure generally, and of the US Constitution and the reach of its courts specifically. Lale Khalili argues that the law is essential to how the United States operates its detention centers, including Guantanamo and others. It is not a lack of law that makes Guantanamo possible, but rather a proliferation of legal analysis and procedure. If one considers Guantanamo Bay to be a separate place beyond the rule of law, then one may miss how its existence and techniques perhaps sketch the outline of the law. That is to say, the legal excess of Guantanamo Bay is precisely the point of departure for understanding how and why law and the specter of it operates to create paradoxical logics. One such paradoxical logic at Guantanamo Bay, and one guiding my opening question, is that of care. Today, I'll explore how the legal excess of Guantanamo Bay defines the military's logic of care. For example, the enhanced interrogation program orchestrated by the Bush administration post 9/11 justified torture and extreme force while insisting upon the sanctity of biological life, simultaneously and paradoxically. Such competing logics of care legitimate the practice of force-feeding hunger strikers over the course of 2 decades at Guantanamo Bay. The military frames force-feeding as an act of care because it facilitates the preservation of biological life. To this end, my interest is in the relationship between care and violence and how medical care is structured at the detention camps towards carceral and punitive ends. Such assemblages of care not only obfuscate the military's insidious regulation of life and death, but also attempt to foreclose collective and relational practices of care organized by those held captive, such as hunger striking. These logics are also apparent in the military's discussions concerning the eventual need for end-of-life care, which can encompass a wide range of care practices for patients near the end of life. End-of-life care may include palliative care, medical care meant to manage serious illnesses such as cancer, or hospice care provided when a physician deems a patient unlikely to live beyond 6 months. Both palliative and hospice care centralize comfort, emotional support, and quality of life. But unlike palliative care, hospice is meant for patients no longer receiving curative treatment for illness. As long as Guantanamo Bay remains operative, end-of-life care such as hospice will become necessary. None of the prisoners have been diagnosed with cancer as of yet. Still, many now live with high blood pressure and diabetes, which has brought up questions for the military about how they plan on addressing these health concerns without geriatric or palliative care for physicians. In the immediate present, however, ongoing medical care for prisoners' chronic conditions, which are linked to torture techniques practiced throughout the enhanced interrogation program, is of the utmost concern. A recent Physicians for Human Rights report, Deprivation and Despair, states that the torture techniques such as walling, whereby the prisoner is slammed repeatedly up against a wall, are a leading cause of many chronic conditions that are physical and mental, such as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The report also states that medical caretakers at Guantanamo are not allowed to ask prisoners about the history behind their injuries or illness if it's suspected that there is a direct link to interrogation and torture. My interest then is how the military's burgeoning rhetoric of hospice and palliative care at the camp shifts attention away from torture techniques deployed throughout the enhanced interrogation program, giving Guantanamo the semblance of being a site now separate from warfare, a site of new, more humanitarian practices enacted by the US military. And so what has been framed as the early planning stages for terrorism suspects to grow old and die at the detention camp is perhaps also the military's attempts to erase the brutalities of the War on Terror's enhanced interrogation program. Indeed, assistive technologies and mobility aids such as wheelchairs are meant to offer reprieve to the very wearing out of the captive's body that the military made possible. The rhetoric of hospice obscures the conditions giving rise to the disability and debility of those held captive. The rhetoric suggests the cause for the need for ongoing medical care is aging, not decades of torture and confinement. If, as international relations scholar Colleen Bell argues, the military presents the War on Terror's counterinsurgency efforts as more empathetic, humane, and culturally aware, then the Pentagon's consideration of hospice at the detention camp follows a method of counterinsurgery that attempts to, quote, disempower the enemy through indirect means by focusing on protecting and managing the life of the population, end quote. Such a humanitarian logic of war that centralizes care and biological life produces the possibility for both sets of medical practices, force feeding and hospice, to exist simultaneously at the detention camp. And today I'm not really focusing on force feeding, mainly hospice. Force feeding is part of my larger work. But today it's really about thinking about the kind of speculative nature of hospice at the camps. I argue that the military is using the possibility of hospice as a curative, both politically and rhetorically, to disavow the effects of torture on the body. By suggesting hospice as politically curative, I mean to suggest and develop a more robust view of cure, one that understands cure as an ideology informed by military and medical industrial complex logic and practice that invests in medical experimentation. To this end, the state experiments with the possibility of hospice care, even if only rhetorically, as a way to attest for disability and debility by pointing to the prisoner's age or even past without ever accounting for the US military's role in the torture, isolation, and disability of these individuals. In 2018, Carol Rosenberg again reported that US military commanders at the naval station appealed to Congress to fund a wheelchair-accessible prison wing that would include a hospice care cell block at a cost of $69 million. Navy Commander Ann Lianos, a spokesperson for Guantanamo, stated, quote, "Picture in your mind elderly detainees, brothers taking care of one another. That is the humane way ahead," end quote. Medically, the goal of hospice is to provide the maximum level of comfort to the dying patient and to root medical decision-making in the patient's autonomy. Although past and present prison commanders have been vocal about the need for end-of-life care at the camps and the growing urgency to provide complex care for prisoners with chronic ailments, it remains unclear how the military will navigate hospice care, necessitating patient autonomy. Rosenberg writes that as of now, military personnel must travel from the military base to Jacksonville, Florida to receive more complicated medical care, and prisoners with non-routine needs must have a specialist come to the camps. Although there are at least 140 doctors, nurses, and mental health providers at Guantanamo, all of whom attend to both prisoners and the assigned troops, there is still no physician specializing in hospice and geriatric medicine. As such, the military has begun researching how the Federal Bureau of Prisons handles hospice care. The militarization of care at Guantanamo speaks to a continuum of liberal carceral violence that seeks to belie existing tensions between hospice and medical neglect, respectively. The military's rhetorical move towards hospice and brotherly care cannot mask Guantanamo's imperialist ethno-racial projects, even when hospice is presented under the guise of progressive humanitarian reform. And just to make clear, hospice as a standalone approach to death and dying isn't the object of my critique, right? Rather, I'm critiquing how the military invokes the language of hospice to extend indefinite detention and thus how it masks the ongoing death-making of captivity. More, the military's interest in end-of-life technologies distracts from how captivity and the afterlife of torture have become quotidian and ordinary at the camps. For instance, the military's coercive use of the feeding tube suggests that the increased technologization of torture prioritizes mere biological life through the elevation of medical techniques and rhetoric. In understanding the feeding tube as not only a medical prosthetic, but also a torture instrument, I suggest that the military's tactics demonstrate that the war on terror depends on an increasing militarization of care and on legitimating itself through the use of biotechnologies. What is exceptional about Guantanamo Bay and the biopolitics of force feeding is how the US military weaponizes technology in the name of care and life itself. The prison hospital is the site par excellence of the ideological battle between biological life and political life. The military maintains that force feeding is in line with an ethics of care. But one text I've been writing about, former Guantanamo Bay prisoner Mansour Addafi's memoir, Don't Forget Us Here, tells another story and prompts those of us on the outside to reconceptualize relationality and care inside. Addafi writes of the complicated feelings evoked by the introduction of communal living at the camps in 2008. In communal living, he experienced more direct contact and relationality with other prisoners and attended art and computer classes. He also gained access to technology such as television and video games. With communal living came a more explicit relational form of life inside the camps. Addafi states, quote, "We had been friends and brothers for years. Since the beginning, we had forged deep bonds fighting and resisting the camp admin and interrogators. But we had still experienced the worst of Guantanamo alone, in our cages or in interrogations. In these casual conversations where we sat around drinking coffee, we processed what we had been through and that somehow made us feel like we hadn't been alone," end quote. Excuse me real quick. The collective care that Commander Llanos imagines facilitated only by hospice and death is articulated by Addafi as inherent to the social bonds and family he had created with the other men in prison. Yet he also understands the homier and more domestic aspects of communal living as a detractor. He writes, quote, "The US government knew that they couldn't close the camp, so they made just enough improvements to distract us from demanding our freedom. Our bodies were very weak from so many years of protests and fighting, and our health had gotten worse. Some of us had diabetes now, or heart conditions, high blood pressure, or kidney problems," end quote. The health conditions that the US military now seeks to remedy with accessible technologies and more sophisticated medical care have been concerns for prisoners since the opening of the camps in 2002. For the US military, the possibility of hospice marks the end of Guantanamo being understood as a site that aids in the war on terror, and now it is a site to be managed more humanely in the afterlife of war. The question at the beginning of the war was how to extract intelligence by any means necessary. Now the question is how to facilitate a legitimate and perhaps even more dignified death for those who remain. Both of these logics are facilitated by coercive logics of care and the military's commitment to stretching out the temporality of punishment to its limits. Addafi links temporality with the effects of torture on his body-mind, but also with the quotidian nature of violence at the camps. Quote, "Life at Guantanamo had become a job for all of us. The interrogator's job was to torture us, the guard's job was to kick our asses every day, and a brother's job was to fight back and give the guards as much work as possible. It was like a factory job for us, doing the same thing every day, day after day. We woke, we prayed, we were tortured, we ate, we fought, we slept, and then we started the cycle all over again. Some of us had suffered serious injuries that never fully healed. Guards had broken my ankle, my wrist, my fingers, and my nose several times. It was the same for other brothers. Some had their backs broken, their teeth knocked out, and even worse. The pain became routine, but that didn't lessen the pain," end quote. Adafi's testimony draws our attention to how the military's reading of the captive's ailments as merely effects of aging necessarily erase the physical and psychic evidence of torture inscribed on the body mind of the prisoner. These practices obscure the underlying causes of what is being framed as aging and disability, while also distorting and relying on temporal relations between aging and disability. The military's proffered rationale is that advanced care for chronic conditions is necessary because the prisoners are aging. But given his account, it is clear that medical intervention and eventually palliative and hospice care are also necessary because of the disabling effects of the military's daily torture. Both hospice and force feeding function according to logics of both care and coercion. I suggest that discussions about the eventual necessity of hospice are also a means by which the military can figuratively and literally erase the psychic and corporeal residues of torture. More, hospice is an opportunity to undo the ethno-racialized and ethno-religious descriptions of the mad Muslim terrorists developed and reified by military psychology throughout the war on terror and replace it with brothers taking care of one another. Thus, hospice offers the possibility of transforming Guantanamo from a notorious torture site to one of homey domestication and caretaking. Refusing narratives of humanitarian reform at Guantanamo, then, is crucial in order to better disaggregate militarized care from the communal care described by Adafi. Time moves forward, and with it, the US military attempts to erase the brutality of the War on Terror's enhanced interrogation program with new life-preserving technologies and rhetorics meant to offer reprieve to the very wearing out of the captive's body that they inflicted. Lauren Berlant describes this as slow death, which they define as the, quote, physical wearing out of a population in a way that points to its deterioration as a defining condition of its experience and historical existence, end quote. Berlant makes clear that their interest is in the applicability of slow death to spaces of ordinariness that animate late capitalism. Guantanamo appears to eschew the ordinary and to be aligned with the unfolding of a traumatic event. Yet, Berlant's notion of slow death articulates how indefinite detention is precisely the technology that slowly wears out its population. Hospice, like force feeding, hinges on the slow debilitation of the body-mind over time. Indeed, both practices are predicated on the temporality of waiting. Ultimately, such emerging technologies of war deployed through open-air prisons and detention centers, among other carceral sites, debilitate subjects over time, disrupting a number of dualities having to do with life, death, and temporality. The aging body in detention, like the aging body outside of confinement, becomes disabled, and with it, a distinct type of incapacitation emerges. An incapacitation that is both the physiological response to getting older and what the space of detention facilitates and over time necessitates. Similar to how military officials at the detention camp have maintained that force feeding captives is in the interest of preserving life, such officials now maintain that hospice care is also in the interest of facilitating a good death for the men who may never be released. With the feeding tube already used to sustain life and the possibility of hospice to facilitate death, the detention hospital at Guantanamo Bay will have engaged in a set of tactics that use the rhetoric of care to ultimately manage life and death. Guantanamo psychiatrist Dr. Steven Zanakis states, quote, "It is paradoxical, but we don't let people just die in this country. It violates all of our ethics and medical ethics," end quote. The irony here is that hunger striking underscores one's own morbidity as the ultimate risk and commitment to one's cause. It is an ethical statement, and it is in a gentle death. At Guantanamo, this possibility has necessarily been foreclosed since the first hunger strikes in 2002. Yet now a new kind of death, the pretense of a good death, looms over Guantanamo's horizon. The US military doesn't just let people die. It controls when and whether captives are ever allowed to die. Indeed, the state continues to expose just how much it has invested in the regulation of death, deciding its breadth and scope. Slow death for Berlant is about the reproduction of predictable life. The space of detention is one of ongoingness, getting by, and living on, even as it's a space in opposition to autonomy and sovereignty, where life becomes one of maintenance, not self-fashioning. At Guantanamo, technologies of maintenance and care reproduce and reconfigure a violent past into a normative future where the physiological process of aging is ultimately what takes biological life and not torture by the state. Dying in indefinite detention then becomes coextensive with the ethical facilitation of the end of life. And here is a photograph of one of the medical consultation rooms at Guantanamo Bay. In a 2021 follow-up, Carol Rosenberg reported that Congress had rejected the military's request to expand Guantanamo to include a new hospice wing. Presently being built, however, is a $124 million dormitory-style barracks for about 850 prison guards. It remains unclear whether Guantanamo administrators continue to make appeals for support in providing end-of-life care in the form of physicians and facilities. As military personnel at Guantanamo imagine what life might look like beyond the war on terror at the detention camps, 36 captives remain waiting. And while my interest is in how the rhetoric of hospice functions as a discursive project for the afterlife of torture, even its proposal highlights the military's investment in the detention camp and its potential for a range of carceral uses. And so if we accept that hospice can't erase the brutalities of the war on terror's enhanced interrogation program, what can we imagine for those who remain captive at the detention camps? The answer in part might lie in reconceptualizing relationality and care as they relate to our abolitionist imaginaries that refuse carceral reforms. Disentangling carceral care from radical and collective care is imperative if we are to remain critical of military reforms at the camp. The possibility of hospice at Guantanamo provides a necessary site of refusal precisely because it illuminates ever-expanding carceral reforms and how the state leverages medicine, scientific rationales, and biotechnologies to serve its death-making imperialist ends. This approach to hospice at Guantanamo Bay pushes us toward more fundamental questions about why anything less than the immediate closure of the detention camps will always be insufficient. Importantly, however, modes of refusal, such as the care and solidarity that the men at Guantanamo created and continue to create for one another, is also a site of ongoing struggle, one beyond capture and recuperation by the military and carceral state. Thank you. I'm sad I'm not there for question and answer. I'm sure it's going to be a good discussion, but I'd love to hear from anyone who wants to continue the conversation. There's my email. So yeah, thank you so much for listening.